What happens when a king builds for eternity, and eternity never comes? Most people don't know his name. He's not in the textbooks, not in the museum gift shops. But 4,400 years ago, Sahure ruled Egypt, and he built a pyramid, one meant to rival Giza, to carry his soul into the stars, to outlast time itself. But today, his monument slouches in the sand, half buried, half forgotten, not destroyed by war, not crumbled by time, collapsed from within. I didn't come here looking for answers. I came with questions. Why did this pyramid fail? Why was the burial chamber empty? And why was the architect's name erased? If you're new here, welcome to Erased Epochs, where we follow the lost trails of history. Not the golden empires and polished statues, but the ruins that fell quiet, and the people who vanished with them. What you're about to see is not just a collapse of stone, it's the unraveling of a vision. A king's ambition swallowed by silence, and clues scattered across the sands, waiting to be read. This is more than archaeology. It's a journey. And if you listen closely, the past still speaks. Let's begin. The desert was still that morning, but not silent. Somewhere beyond the dunes, a muffled groan echoed. Like the earth exhaling, stone had given way to sand. And in that moment, a pyramid, once promised to eternity, began to fall back into the earth. I wasn't there when it happened. I arrived days later, but I could feel it, in the way the air hung heavy with dust, in the way the ground whispered beneath my boots. The pyramid of Sahure had collapsed not all at once, but decisively, as though it had made a quiet decision to surrender. From a distance, it still looked like a monument, a sloped silhouette rising above the Abusir plateau, its angles softened by centuries of wind. But up close, it was a ruin unmaking itself. Blocks sagged like tired limbs. Steps meant to ascend into the heavens, now dipped into hollows and voids. A shell not of grandeur, but of memory. I set camp just north of the complex. That night, I sat by my fire, staring out across the dark. I imagined the moment it happened, a slow shift in weight, a single cornerstone giving way, dust rising like smoke, and then silence. But this wasn't just time's doing. Something had gone wrong here. The next morning, I walked the perimeter, traced the fall lines of dislodged stones. Some still lay where they had landed, others half buried in the sand, as if ashamed to be seen. I knelt beside one, a casing stone, finely cut but fractured. Its underside was dark with soil, too soft. The limestone beneath had crumbled under pressure. Nearby, a ceremonial mace head poked through the rubble, ivory, copper inlay, intact. That was strange. Looters never leave objects like this, which meant it wasn't looted. It was left behind. In haste. Further in, beneath the collapsed eastern corridor, I found wall inscriptions. Partial, but legible. Praises for the king, prayers to Ra, scenes of harvest. But none of it was finished. Paint lines trailed off into bare stone, figures half-carved. The story paused and never resumed. The wind picked up. Sand swept through the hollow chamber. It didn't feel like decay. It felt like withdrawal, as if the builders had been called away mid-step, or silenced. Locals speak of a storm, a great one generations ago that revealed the interior chambers and then buried them again. They say lights flicker near the ruins on moonless nights. They say voices carry on the wind. One man, a site guardian who'd watched over Abusir for 40 years, told me simply, this pyramid was never meant to stand. Not because of a curse, not because of poor planning, but because the vision was too heavy for the earth it stood on. Sahure had dared something new, a faster way to build, a different approach to power. But sometimes the land doesn't agree. And when the land speaks, it speaks through stone. I stood at the heart of the ruin, one hand pressed against a leaning wall. It was still warm with Sunday, still strong in places. But underneath I could hear it, the subtle crackle of shifting weight. The whisper of collapse still ongoing. Some ruins fade, others fall. But this one, it was unraveling. And I knew then, this was no ordinary monument. It was a message, a warning, left in broken angles and sinking stone. The house of the king had not been destroyed. It had simply let go. And I had come not to save it, but to listen. Because in the desert, it is the silence after the collapse that speaks the loudest. The first time I saw his face, it was not in a grand statue or temple engraving. It was on a weathered shard of basalt, tucked in the storerooms of the Cairo Museum. A cheekbone, an ear, the faint trace of a serene gaze. The label simply read, Sahure, and almost no one stopped to look. In the vast pantheon of Egypt's pharaohs, Sahure is a name whispered, not sung. He ruled early in the 5th dynasty, an age of transformation. The old gods were shifting, the pyramids were growing smaller, and power was learning to wear subtler robes. Sahure didn't command armies like Ramses. He didn't boast towering monuments like Khufu, but what he left behind is different, quieter, more intimate, and perhaps more revealing. His pyramid at Abusir was the first constructed at the site, bridging the gap between the towering plateaus of Giza and the more clustered necropolises to the south. It was smaller, yes, but more intricate, more experimental. Inside his mortuary temple, Sahure's artisans broke the mold. They etched stories into stone, not with rigid formality, but with motion, emotion, detail. You don't just see Sahure seated on a throne. You see him walking among his people, accepting tribute, inspecting livestock, raising a hand in peace to foreign envoys. He was a ruler who did not need to loom. He needed only to be seen. In one fragment, he's depicted cradling incense brought back from Punt, a distant land across the Red Sea. His fleets reached farther than those of his predecessors. His hands brought myrrh, electrum, rare animals, and yet his name drifts in the margins of history. Why? It may be because Sahure's reign coincided with a philosophical shift. Power was decentralizing, the cult of Ra was rising. The gods were being drawn closer to the living, and the pharaoh, once an untouchable divine force, began to seem more mortal. Some historians see this as a diminishment. I don't. I see a king who understood that legacy isn't built solely in height, but in vision. And vision, as Sahure knew, is often invisible at first. His pyramid complex introduced layout innovations, compact internal arrangements, elevated foundations, efficient corridor design. These features became the blueprint for later kings. And yet, his own name would be overwritten, his complex repurposed. Successors carved over his reliefs. Others took blocks from his walls. Even in death, he was made to yield. But the design endured. I stood once inside what remains of his inner chamber, beneath a cracked lintel, and watched the light slant across the floor, dust caught in golden beams. And for a moment, I felt it, that flicker of ambition. Not grandiosity, but purpose. Sahure wasn't forgotten because he failed. He was forgotten because he was subtle. A king of firsts, a king of transitions. And in that way, perhaps the most modern of them all. I found a seal near the edge of the temple complex. Just a small clay disc, no larger than a coin. It read, Sahure, beloved of Ra. That name has not been spoken in common memory for millennia. But out here, in the silence of the dunes, it still lingers. You just have to listen for it. You don't expect to find a scroll tube beneath a pyramid. And yet, that's exactly what we found, wedged between two crumbling foundation stones on the western slope of Sahure's complex. The tube was ceramic, scorched at one end, sealed with a plug of black resin. It had been hidden with purpose. Inside, wrapped in linen now stiff with age, was a parchment, fragile, flaked with every breath, but enough survived to reveal what it once held. A plan. Not a royal decree, not a prayer, but a blueprint. Angles, measurements, load bearings, technical sketches of internal chambers, stairwells, and supporting columns, architectural notes written in red ochre. And across the margins, corrections heavy ones, chamber walls redrawn, access corridors repositioned, even a burial shaft moved closer to the pyramid's core. It was like seeing a ghost of the monument that might have been. I brought the fragments to an engineer specializing in ancient construction. His verdict was quick. This was a last-minute revision, a structural correction. Someone realized too late that the base was failing. The signs had been there all along. The cracked foundation, the irregular spacing of corridor walls, the awkward taper of the burial chamber. This wasn't just erosion or time's cruelty. This was a design struggling to hold itself together. What stood at Abusir wasn't a perfect pyramid. It was a rescue mission. And someone, perhaps the chief architect himself, tried to salvage it from within. But there's more. At the bottom of the parchment, faint, almost erased, was a line written in a different hand. Delay no more. Begin the seal. Seal what? And why the urgency? We returned to the coordinates referenced in the sketch. Beneath a collapsed wall on the northern face, we found a narrow shaft filled with rubble. When cleared, it led to a dead end, a chamber deliberately bricked shut. The masonry was rushed. The mortar, uneven. A burial shaft? A failed annex? Or something they meant to hide? We'll never know. But standing in that unfinished tunnel, I realized something. This pyramid, so often cited as a step forward in design, had been wounded in its infancy. Not by enemies, not by time, but by the quiet battle between ambition and possibility. And that blueprint? It wasn't a declaration of what was built. It was a confession. The story we tell about ancient Egypt is often one of perfection symmetrical pyramids, eternal gods, unshakable empires. But Sahure's blueprint reminds us that the builders weren't just carving monuments. They were navigating failure. They were adjusting, compromising, improvising. Because even in a civilization obsessed with permanence, things fell apart. This scroll was never meant to be seen. It wasn't buried ceremonially. It was hidden, like a secret the architect couldn't bear to destroy, even as the walls gave way. It survived only by accident. But it speaks louder than any polished relief or triumphal inscription. It says, "This didn't go as planned." And in its honesty, it tells us more than perfection ever could. There's a sound limestone makes when it's tired. Not a crack, not a crumble. A low, subtle groan like a breath drawn through clenched teeth. That's what I heard as I walked the base of Sahure's pyramid. Not decay, but protest. The core blocks beneath my boots felt soft. Not in the way of age, but in the way of something that never should have been used. I brushed away a layer of wind-blown grit and ran my fingers across the surface. The stone gave slightly, crumbling at the edges, chalky. This wasn't Tura limestone, the prized bright white stone of Giza's perfection. This was local quarry debris, inferior, cheaper, lighter, easier to move, easier to lose. A structural compromise. I took samples to a geologist working nearby. Her conclusion came fast and grim. This material was never meant to bear weight on this scale, she said. It was a pyramid waiting to fall. But why? The Egyptians of the 5th Dynasty knew their materials. They weren't experimenting blindly. They understood the consequences. So what changed? As we mapped the remaining blocks, we saw a pattern emerge. The outer casing stones, now mostly gone, had once been fine. Smooth, elegant. But behind them, the core was chaotic. Mixed stone. Rubble fill. Irregularly sized blocks packed like a puzzle no one finished. In one section, we found a reused block with traces of older carvings clearly stripped from another structure. Even the orientation was wrong. The block was installed upside down, its chisel marks facing out toward the sand. Recycling wasn't uncommon in ancient Egypt, but this wasn't careful reuse. This was desperation. The mortuary temple showed similar signs. Some of the wall cores had been patched with gypsum mortar mixed with crushed shells, an organic filler that expands and contracts with heat. Over time, it would have weakened everything it touched. One beam had split entirely. This wasn't erosion. This was structural failure built into the foundation. And yet the pyramid stood at least, for a while. Because appearances mattered, because kings needed monuments, and perhaps because the reign of Sahure demanded a statement more than it demanded survival. Still, I couldn't help but imagine the builders, the masons who laid the core, the overseers who watched the scaffolds lean under weight that no plan could hold. Did they know? Did they whisper warnings no one wanted to hear? Or did they tell themselves what we all do when asked to work beyond our limits? Just finish it. Let it stand. Let it look right. And it did look right. Until it didn't. We don't know exactly when the pyramid began to give way, whether it was a decade, a century, or a millennium later, but the evidence suggests it wasn't erosion that caused the first break. It was within, wrought in the skeleton. A monument built to last 1,000 years, undermined from the moment it rose. As I stood beside one fractured wall, I pressed my hand to the stone and felt it yield slightly beneath me. This wasn't just stone. This was a choice. And every collapse, I've learned, begins with one. The road to the workers' village was little more than a memory. A faint depression in the sand, lined with eroded post holes and sunken mud brick. No grand gate, no boundary wall. Just the quiet suggestion that once life moved through this dust with purpose. This is where the pyramid was truly built. Not in the royal chamber, not on the monument's summit, but here, in sweat, smoke, and fire. Where men shaped stone with copper and will. Where bread rose beside embers. Where songs rose at sunset. Now, it's silent. I moved through the remnants with care. Low walls, burned hearths, clay pots shattered in place, as if dropped mid-meal. We found bone fragments of fish and goat, the remains of barley, and even a bread mold still intact after 4,000 years. These weren't slaves. They were skilled laborers, respected, fed, given rest and ritual. But beneath the signs of order was something else. In the northeast quadrant, under a collapsed lean-to, we found a broken ostracon, a pottery shard used for informal notes. On it, etched in a hurried hand, were the words, "He does not see us." It repeated in other fragments. The same hand, the same phrase. Always hidden in discarded trash heaps. Always buried, as if meant not to be found. It wasn't religious. It wasn't administrative. It was personal. I asked a linguist about the phrasing. His brow furrowed. "It reads like lament," he said. "Like a worker speaking of a king or a god who no longer watches. Not rebellion. Resignation." At the southern edge of the camp, we found an anomaly. A single human burial beneath what had once been a chisel workshop. The bones were unceremonious. No amulets, no wrappings. His wrist was broken. His ribs fractured. Collapsed scaffolding? A punishment? We'll never know. But beside him lay a toolkit. Chisel, mallet, plumb line. Still aligned. Still waiting. As if someone meant to come back for them, and never did. One shelter, smaller than the rest, had preserved a fire pit. Inside, beneath layers of ash, was a palm-sized figure crudely made. No royal likeness. Just a man, seated, head in hands, a silent witness to something unspoken. This wasn't just a labor site. It was a village of voices. And some of those voices were tired. Some unheard. I imagined a man at the end of his shift, his hands raw, his back aching, staring up at a monument he knows isn't right, watching cracks grow wider, walls lean further, and wondering, Why are we still building? Did he carve "He does not see us" into the shard? Was it defiance? Or grief? These fragments won't be displayed in a museum. There's no gold here, no crowns, no secrets of the gods. Only this, a whisper from a vanished village. From the ones who built what kings would later claim. And perhaps, in the end, the truest story of the pyramid is not in its fall, but in the hands that tried to hold it up. The Nile is not just a river. In Egypt, it is the pulse of existence, a ribbon of life in a land of death, the giver of grain, of trade, of time. And yet, even gods change course. By the time Sahure laid the first stones of his pyramid at Abusir, the Nile had already begun to shift subtly but steadily away. Today, when you stand at the edge of his pyramid's ruined causeway and look eastward, there's only desert, but ancient soil cores and sediment analysis tell a different story. Millennia ago, a canal once flowed nearby. Barges heavy with granite and incense would have drifted silently up to the edge of the construction site. Then, the water receded. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but year by year, the floodplain thinned, the water table dropped, and what was once a harbor of logistical perfection became an island of dust. For Sahure's builders, it must have felt like betrayal. The pyramid had been placed with intention close enough to the old river route to receive supplies, aligned with the heavens, linked with the divine. But the Nile had other plans. Transport slowed. Labor grew harder. Stone had to be hauled farther, food brought in with difficulty. The workers' village began to shrink. More and more time was spent digging for water, less for building a king's eternity. And that's when the omissions began. No triumphal inscriptions about the arrival of stone by boat. No reliefs celebrating river processions. Just gaps where water should have been. Only silence. I found a half-buried stele in the Valley Temple, its upper half broken, its base still anchored in bedrock. The inscription was simple, faded, but it bore the glyphs for drought and for patience. A priest's plea. Not to the gods, but to the river. It read, "Return, that we may rise." Elsewhere in the site's outer court, we uncovered a cache of offerings, jars of dried grain and fish bones, sealed with desperation. Not placed to honor the dead, but to plead with the living forces of nature. Some scholars believe these were part of a ritual, a sacrifice, not to Ra, but to the Nile itself. Because in ancient belief, when water withdraws, it is not random, it is judgment. And when the river turns its back, so too may the gods. Was the river's retreat seen as a sign? Did the priests question Sahure's favor? Did the people? Even the geometry of the pyramid responds to this change. The sloping angles, once calculated to mirror celestial paths, began to distort. Builders rushed, materials cheapened, and the monument sagged into itself. It's easy to see the collapse as a structural failure, but perhaps it was first a spiritual one. I walked the dry canal bed at dusk, now nothing more than a trench filled with sand and thorned weeds. The wind moved like water between the stones, and I imagined the last priest standing at its edge, watching the boats never come, whispering a prayer into a sky that did not answer. Not all ruins are made by hands. Some are made by absence. And in the story of Sahure, perhaps the first crack was not in the stone, but in the river that chose to flow elsewhere. There was no mark on the wall, no chisel line, no joint, just smooth stone. But when I pressed my hand against it, it gave a sound faint, hollow, wrong. We had stumbled upon a false wall, one not listed in the original plans, not mapped in any survey, and it had been sealed with intention. Carefully, but not reverently. What lay behind was not meant to be found. We broke through at dawn, working slowly, whispering as if the stone itself might listen. Dust spilled out first, dry, bitter, clinging to the throat. Then, darkness, the kind that feels thick. Still, a room untouched by breath for centuries. Our lanterns revealed a small chamber, no larger than a stable, no reliefs, no inscriptions, no light wells. But it wasn't empty. The walls were lined with rush mats, now petrified into the contours of time. Clay jars stood in the corners, some cracked, some sealed with resin. A few contained dried fig seeds, others had turned to dust. A reed basket lay collapsed near the far side. It held nothing. And in the center of the room sat a statue, diorite, headless, seated in the pose of command. The torso bore no name, no title, but the arms were shaped to cradle something now long gone. The strangest part? The eyes had been gouged out. Deliberately. Who was it meant to represent? A priest? A guardian? A forgotten heir? Or was it the king himself? We circled the chamber in silence. The air had weight. Every breath felt borrowed. This was not a burial space, not a shrine. It was a vault of secrecy. Then we saw the glyphs. Tiny, faint, scratched with urgency across a linen scrap jammed into a ceiling niche. One symbol, repeated again and again. RTP, silence. Not peace, not rest. Silence. It wasn't a message. It was a warning. There was something else in that room. Not seen, not heard, but felt. The kind of unease that grows in your bones, that makes the hairs on your neck rise like a tide. We documented everything. Photographed the scene, collected samples. But I hesitated before touching the statue. Not out of superstition, out of respect. Whatever happened here, it was covered for a reason. Some believe this was a ritual chamber, a failed attempt at spiritual sealing. Others think it was punishment, a place of exile for a disgraced official, a memory buried alive. But when I asked a local elder, he said only this: some names are removed, not because they failed, but because they were seen too clearly. And that stuck with me, because this room didn't feel like a forgotten corner. It felt like a decision, a place made not to protect, but to suppress. When we left, I turned once more toward the sealed doorway, now open to the air. I wondered what we'd disturbed, what silence we'd broken, and whether it would settle again. Some rooms are built to echo. This one wasn't. It was built to keep quiet. Every monument has a mind behind it. A designer. A master of angles and stone. A name. But in Sahure's pyramid complex, that name is missing. There is no inscription crediting an overseer of works. No tomb honoring a royal architect. Not a single carved title acknowledging the hand that brought vision into structure. And in ancient Egypt, where names were everything, that silence is deafening. It was near the southern trench that we found the first clue. A limestone tablet, shattered in 3 pieces. One fragment bore hieroglyph standard, courtly titles. Another showed a figure seated, drafting tools in hand, eyes focused forward. The third, a blank where the name should be, chiseled out so deeply that the stone beneath had fractured. It wasn't erosion, it was erasure. Someone had wanted this man forgotten. But you can't hide style. As we traced the geometry of Sahure's temple, we began to notice patterns. Corridors that curved gently to guide procession. Ceilings proportioned for light play during solstices. A burial chamber aligned not just to cardinal points, but to specific stars. This was not improvised, it was genius. And yet, unclaimed. Why? In an archived excavation report from the early 1900s, I found a sketch of a small votive stela uncovered near the causeway. It had since been lost. But the drawing showed 2 men back to back, one with tools raised, the other lowered. The inscription read, "They built side by side, but only one remained." Scholars dismissed it as metaphor. I'm not so sure. There's evidence of a mid-project shift in Sahure's pyramid. The angles change, the materials cheapen, the symmetry falters. Blueprints, recovered in fragments, show revisions written in different hands. Even the burial chamber was altered, narrowed, shortened, as if someone else took over. Was there a falling out? A failure? Did the architect object to the shortcuts, the stone choices, the rush? Or did something darker unfold? In ancient records from later dynasties, there's a mention of a master of stone whose name was taken for speaking against the line. No location is given, no name. But the timing fits. It's possible Sahure's original architect was removed not just from his post, but from memory. And in Egypt, to be nameless is to be undone. I find myself drawn to that idea. That somewhere within the crumbling walls and flawed geometry of this pyramid is a ghost. Not a spirit, but a mind. A person whose work lives on in angles and shadows, but whose name was stolen. I stood once in the half-collapsed corridor of the inner sanctuary. Light filtered through a crack in the ceiling, illuminating a plumb line etched into the wall, a mason's guide, never erased. It was perfect. Invisible to the casual eye, but unmistakable once you knew how to see. That line, more than any inscription, is his signature. Whoever he was, he built something that endured far longer than memory. And in the end, perhaps that's the quiet rebellion of the vanished architect. To have no name, but leave a design that still holds. The causeway should have led to the stars. In ancient Egypt, these long ritual corridors were more than stone paths, they were journeys. Sacred arteries connecting the valley temple to the pyramid. Lined with images of offerings, festivals, victories. Chants were sung along them. Incense burned. The king's soul was meant to walk this road into eternity. But Sahure's causeway stops. Abruptly, mid-slope. I followed it early one morning, just as the sun crested the eastern ridge. The blocks were warm underfoot, but cracked. Some tilted, others piled off center. At first glance, it looks like erosion. But the truth is simpler and stranger. It was never finished. The lower foundation is solid, well laid, but after a certain point, the stones become sparse, misaligned. A few are still stacked nearby, as if waiting. The kind of scene you expect from a modern construction site, not an ancient one. But here, time froze mid-task. We found offering tables beside the incomplete section's simple altars of red granite. But there are no burn marks, no residue. They were carved, placed, and left untouched. One stele, broken near its base, still bore a prayer. May his name rise on the road of light. But there was no road. Just a broken slope. Inside the valley temple, fragments of a grand processional scene were uncovered years ago. Sahure, arms open, flanked by priests. But the wall ends in bare plaster. The carving was never completed. It simply stops. This wasn't vandalism. This was abandonment. Why? Some say funding dried up. Others point to rising political tensions, perhaps a shift in power near the end of Sahure's reign. But I wonder if it's something deeper. Because in Egypt, a completed causeway wasn't just architectural, it was cosmological. It was the soul's path. And to leave it unfinished was to leave the soul waiting. One archaeologist described it as a spiritual void in stone. I think that's accurate. I stood where the causeway meets the mortuary temple. It should have been the crescendo where rites reached their peak, but instead, it was quiet. The floor was uneven, the joints misaligned. Offerings that had been prepared were never placed. The room was missing its voice. In a dusty alcove near the foundation, we found something strange. A carved fragment, flipped upside down. On its exposed face, the word, forgiveness. Not addressed to a god, not addressed to the king. Just a plea. Unfinished prayers. Unanswered echoes. I looked out from the highest point of the causeway, back toward the Nile's vanished course. The wind carried dust across the stones. No chants, no steps, just the empty space where ceremony should have been. Sometimes, what isn't built speaks louder than what is. And here, on this slope of forgotten stone, the silence is absolute. Not broken, not interrupted, just unfulfilled. Temples are built to speak. In Egypt, they were designed to echo with divinity, walls alive with color, ceilings arched like the heavens, every inch singing the names of gods. To enter one was to step into the breath of the sacred. But in Sahure's mortuary temple, the gods are silent, and not by accident. We entered through a broken colonnade, columns snapped at their bases, reliefs peeled by centuries of wind, but deeper inside, where the sun barely reaches, the walls still hold their stories. Or rather, what's left of them. I ran my hand along a panel that once showed Ra in radiant stride. His form is still visible, but the face? Gone, not faded, not worn. Gouged out. Deliberately. Elsewhere, Osiris, the god of the afterlife, stands in judgment. But his name has been chiseled away, not just once, multiple times. So violently, the glyphs around it cracked. This wasn't erosion, it was erasure. In ancient Egyptian belief, to strike out a name is to remove power. To blind an image is to unmake the god it represents. These were not random acts of vandalism. They were acts of defiance, of fear, or perhaps of punishment. But from whom and why? Some scholars argue that this was done in a later dynasty, a theological purge. Others think it happened during Sahure's own reign, in response to shifting religious tides. The 5th dynasty marked the rise of the solar cult of Ra. Old gods were being rewritten, rival priesthoods lost favor, power was shifting from temple to king. Was this temple caught in the middle? We found offering vessels in side chambers shattered in place. The residue inside them had dried, hardened, not looted, not stolen, just left. As if the rites were begun, then suddenly halted. One small alabaster basin bore an inscription. Most of it was defaced, but one phrase remained. "May they hear no more." A chilling line. Was it a curse? A command? Or the record of a silence already felt? I sat in the sanctuary for a long time. The ceiling had partially collapsed, casting the room in dappled twilight. Dust floated like incense. The walls were scarred, but the space still held presence. And absence. The kind of absence that feels intentional. As if something had once filled the air, music, voice, prayer, and now refuses to return. Temples fall all the time, but this one didn't fall. It was quieted. Some names were protected, others were punished. But here, even the divine was unmade. And perhaps that's what makes Sahure's temple so haunting. Not what was lost, but what was taken away on purpose. The gods didn't abandon this place. They were removed. And whatever power once dwelled in these walls, it was silenced not by time, but by will. History often pretends that kingship flows like the Nile, smooth, inevitable, divine. But beneath the surface, there are eddies, whirlpools, fractures, and at the heart of Sahure's story is a break no one wanted to write down. It began with 2 seals, discovered in the debris of the Valley Temple, small, clay discs used to mark storage jars. At first, they seemed identical. Both bore the Horus falcon, perched above a royal cartouche. The border was flawless, the iconography precise. But one of them didn't say Sahure. It said something else. A name not found in official king lists. A name almost completely ground down by time, as if the earth itself had tried to forget. Egyptian succession was supposed to be sacred. The pharaoh, divine. His heir, preordained. But between Sahure and his recorded successor, Neferakare, something went missing. Literally. The Palermo stone, One of our earliest royal annals skips over years in this period. Later temple records are vague. Some list Sahure's sons, others replace their names with titles. There are no surviving reliefs showing a direct coronation, only silence. But the walls remember. In one chamber of the pyramid complex, barely visible under layers of grime and soot, is a scene of two men kneeling before a seated figure. One man wears the sidelock of youth, a son. The other wears the crown of Lower Egypt. Only one has a name. The other's was scratched away. Were they brothers? Rivals? Did one rule briefly before being removed from record? Did Sahure name an heir, only for that heir to be replaced? Or worse, was the succession contested? A fragment of stela from the far side of the complex shows two falcons, each facing opposite directions. Beneath one is a glyph for truth. Beneath the other, the glyph for claim. Not exactly subtle. We also found what appears to be a hastily repurposed sarcophagus lid. The original cartouche was carved off-center, then recut. The new name? Neferirkare. What if he wasn't meant to be king? What if he wasn't first? It would explain the sudden halt in construction, the unfinished causeway, the erased names, the strange layering of design changes within the pyramid. It would also explain the tone of many later records which praise Neferirkare but never mention how he rose. In ancient Egypt, legitimacy was everything. If a king's ascent was questioned, it was hidden, quietly, thoroughly, a name erased, a history rewritten. And here, in Sahure's crumbling shadow, we find the echoes of that rewriting. Not in triumphal inscriptions, but in fragments, gaps, ghosts. I held the damaged seal in my hand. Dust flaked from its edge. The clay was crumbling, but the shape of the lost name, though faint, was still there. A memory trying not to be remembered. Power leaves many traces, but when it's taken too quickly, or claimed too boldly, it leaves cracks. Cracks that pyramids cannot cover. And some of those cracks, even buried beneath centuries of sand, still whisper. We weren't looking for a burial. Not here. Not in the southern courtyard of Sahure's pyramid complex, a space thought to be ceremonial, not sacred. But sometimes, the ground decides what is remembered. It began with a strange dip in the earth, a depression surrounded by loose sandstone. We cleared it carefully, brushing away wind-blown grit, until we reached the edges of a slab. Beneath it was a pit. And inside, a ring of ox skulls. 17 of them, each one turned inward. Their jaws had been sealed with hardened clay. Their eyes pointed to a center that once held fire. Around the ring, alabaster vessels broken, deliberately, as if shattered mid-prayer. A circle of ruin, made by design. This was no feast, no celebration. This was a ritual, but not the kind you find in temple records. The soil beneath the fire pit was blackened, but not with wood ash alone. We found fragments of charred reed, resin clumps, pigment stones, materials used not in sacrifice, but in sealing, in binding. A closer look at the surrounding walls revealed red ochre glyphs scratched hastily across the stone, not carved, but scrawled. Protective symbols, apotropaic markings. Some of them were rare, others almost desperate. One appeared again and again. A closed mouth, crossed by 3 lines. It means silence. But not peaceful silence. Enforced silence. One elder on our team recognized the pattern. He whispered, "This wasn't worship, it was containment." That word stayed with me. We analyzed the bones. No cuts, no signs of slaughter. These animals weren't butchered. They were preserved whole, arranged in ritual stillness. Each skull a watchman, each vessel a lock. At the center of the pit, nothing remained. Whatever had been sealed there had been removed or escaped. I don't say that lightly, because when rites go wrong in Egyptian tradition, they don't just stop, they're erased, removed from record, buried under layers of official silence. This was one of those moments. Perhaps something in the construction failed so badly it was seen as a spiritual rupture. Perhaps a ritual to protect the tomb went awry. Or perhaps Sahure's death or the succession crisis that followed triggered a rite no one wanted to repeat. And so they sealed it. With oxen, with fire, with broken alabaster. Not to celebrate life, but to hold something down. We covered the pit again after documentation, left it undisturbed as we found it. Not out of fear, but reverence. Whatever this was, it mattered deeply to those who performed it. And not every mystery is meant to be solved. Some are meant to be watched. Like the oxen, still circled in dust and silence, waiting. It was just a pottery shard, worn, unremarkable, the kind of debris found by the thousands across Egyptian ruins. It rested among a scatter of sand-drifted ceramics near the collapsed outer court of Sahure's complex. But as I brushed away the dirt, a line of glyphs came into view. Rushed, crooked, etched with a sharp point, not a practiced hand. It read, "The most of woe, the house has fallen." 4 words, and in them, the moment the pyramid died. This wasn't a formal inscription, not carved by a priest or a scribe. It was graffiti, a cry preserved in clay. I turned the shard over. It had once been the rim of a ceremonial basin, the kind used in purification rites before offerings, before burial. That basin shattered during the collapse. We found other fragments nearby. One bore the glyph for sky, followed by a cracked phrase, "May it not break." Another, "Protect the passage." They weren't declarations. They were pleas. This wasn't erosion. This wasn't decay. This was collapse. And someone, perhaps a priest, perhaps a laborer, saw it happen. Imagine the scene. The inner walls trembling, sand trickling from the ceiling, a groan deep in the stone, a basin tipping, smashing, a final look back, then flight. They didn't write it in the records. There are no official mentions of failure in royal archives. The king's pyramid, by decree, was eternal. But clay doesn't lie. This fragment, hidden for millennia, captured the fall no one dared speak of. Even the surrounding structures seemed to remember. We found a wall relief depicting Sahure seated beneath the sun disk, but the base of the panel was cracked. A hairline fracture ran from foot to falcon, as if the very stone had mirrored the break. On the steps outside, a prayer stele had been toppled forward, face down in the sand. Not broken, just silenced. I asked a conservator what might have caused the structural failure. She pointed to the signs: poor material, hasty construction, shifting subsoil. But then she paused. "And sometimes," she said, "things collapse because they're no longer wanted." The pyramid didn't just fall. It was allowed to, not in defiance, not in violence, but in surrender. Because when a king loses the favor of his people, or the river, or the gods, even stone can no longer stand. I kept the shard, not as treasure, not as proof, but as a voice. The voice of someone who stood in that temple, watched the walls crack, and wrote what he saw not in ink, not for history, but because he needed someone to know. The house has fallen. 4 words, and through them, time speaks. The burial chamber was supposed to be the heart, the sacred core of the pyramid, the place where the king would sleep beneath the stars, sealed in stone, surrounded by spells and silence. But when we reached the final corridor of Sahure's pyramid, there was nothing. No sarcophagus, no coffin, no remains. Just a shallow, half-carved chamber with walls that taper into rough stone. No inscriptions, no decoration, no final rites. A burial that never happened. The official records say Sahure was buried here, that his tomb was completed, but the stone disagrees. Every part of the burial chamber feels abandoned mid-task. The ceiling is uneven. The floor dips. The chamber walls still bear the striations of unfinished chiseling, the kind done fast, not well. Most revealing of all, there are no pyramid texts. These were the spells, the sacred writings etched on the walls of royal tombs to guide the soul through the afterlife. Without them, a king's spirit was unguarded. Sahure was among the first rulers of the 5th dynasty. His successors were buried with texts, prayers, celestial maps. But here, only stone. Rough, silent, empty. Some say the tomb was looted. But looters don't erase architectural intention. They don't undo plans. They don't leave a chamber incomplete. Others suggest the king was buried elsewhere secretly, moved during political upheaval, hidden to protect the body. But if that were true, wouldn't we have found evidence? There is none. The most likely answer? He was never buried here at all. That thought echoes in the rest of the complex. The causeway stops midway. The mortuary temple is unfinished. Ritual chambers are empty or repurposed. Priests' quarters have no name lists. The entire complex feels like a body missing its heart. I stood in that chamber for a long time. Dust hung in the air. My footsteps echoed too loudly. I listened for something, anything that might explain it. Nothing came. And yet, that silence spoke volumes. In Egypt, not being buried properly wasn't just a logistical failure, it was a spiritual crisis. Without burial, the soul could not ascend. Without a tomb, the king could not become divine. But Sahure's name lived on. His temple was reused. His innovations were copied. His expeditions remembered. He became a blueprint, not a body. Which raises a strange possibility. What if this pyramid was never meant to be a tomb? What if it was always something else, a prototype, an experiment, a statement? Not for death, but for legacy. And if that's true, then the emptiness is not a flaw. It's the message. A silent monument to a king who ruled boldly, but left no final resting place. And in that void, we are left with the most human mystery of all. Not how he died, but why he was never laid to rest. The burial that never was, may be the truest story this pyramid tells. Evening falls fast at Abusir. The wind stills. The air cools. The light turns gold, then gray, then gone. And in that quiet, the stones begin to speak not with voices, but with presence. I sat on the edge of the pyramid's southern slope, where the casing stones have long since peeled away. Beneath me, the earth was warm from the sun, but the air had already turned. And then, I heard it. A single stone, somewhere above, slipping free. It fell slowly, tumbled once, landed softly in the sand. Not loud, not dramatic, but final. That's how this pyramid is dying. Not with a roar, but with a sigh. Piece by piece, it surrenders. A monument unraveling itself. Not violently, but patiently. And yet, even in ruin, it holds. It endures. Not as it was meant to, but as it became. In that moment, watching the dust settle, I felt the weight of all we'd uncovered. The buried plans, the broken offerings, the names erased, the rites disrupted, the silence where gods once stood. Sahure's pyramid isn't just a collapsed structure, it's a collapsed vision. It was supposed to be a bridge between Giza and the south, between heaven and earth, between old order and new ideology. But it faltered in materials, in politics, in time. Still, it speaks. Every flaw, every crack, every incomplete corridor is a sentence in a language we're only beginning to understand. Because collapse is not the opposite of success. It is its shadow. And shadows in Egypt were sacred. I thought of the workmen. The architect whose name was taken, the priest who carved a cry into clay, the oxen circled in dust, the body never buried. None of them meant for this to happen. And yet, here it is. What does it mean to fail in stone? To build a monument meant to last forever and watch it fall? Maybe it means you tried to do something new. Maybe it means you built for a future that never came. Or maybe the falling was part of the message all along. We look at pyramids and see permanence, but maybe Sahure's broken monument is more honest. It tells us that every structure is temporary, that every king becomes dust, that every name, no matter how sacred, eventually fades. But if someone listens, if someone walks the site, runs their fingers over the stone, reads the gaps between the glyphs, then nothing is truly lost. As I packed my bag and stood to leave, the wind kicked up again. It carried sand across the fallen stones, whispered through the broken temple. And I thought maybe that's Sahure's voice. Not calling for worship, but simply saying, look, even in falling, I remain. The dust still clung to my boots when I left Abusir. I didn't rush. You don't walk away from something like that quickly. Not from a place where the air remembers more than the stones. Not from a monument that failed, but never stopped speaking. Sahure's pyramid is not a wonder of the world. It's not perfect. It's not whole. And maybe that's why it matters more. We often chase the clean lines of history timelines that make sense, legacies wrapped in certainty. But what we found here was something else. Something real. A king who ruled at a crossroads. An architect who vanished into silence. A burial that never came. Prayers interrupted. Gods erased. Stones speaking only as they fell. And in the middle of it all, a monument that tried to be more than it could hold. You see, Sahure didn't just want to be remembered. He wanted to change something. To build faster, smarter. To mark the sky in a new way. He sent ships to punt. He reshaped ritual. He tried. And maybe that's what cost him everything. But try to tell me that's not human. That reaching too far and falling doesn't echo longer than safe success. The pyramid didn't rise to greatness, but it endured collapse. It outlived the hands that built it, the river that fed it, the gods who once watched over it. It still stands hunched, hollow, but unforgotten. Because failure, too, leaves a legacy. And maybe that's the lesson the past keeps whispering, that history isn't a line. It's a landscape, one filled with broken paths and unfinished prayers and questions no one thought to ask. I've walked temples gilded in gold, red walls that sang of victories. But this ruin held more truth than any triumph. It reminded me that even the mighty falter, that the sacred can be silenced, that not every monument stands tall. Some bow and endure anyway. And as I look ahead to the next journey, the next ruin, the next forgotten corner of time, I carry this with me. That every stone holds a story. Every collapse begins with hope. And every silence waits to be heard. This wasn't the end of a pyramid. It was the beginning of a mystery. And we were just lucky enough to listen.